my name is Wendy and I'm 63 years old. I've had multiple sclerosis since I was a child, though I didn't know it then. And I've been sober for 43 years. And for several of those years, after being priced out of the Los Angeles housing market, I lived in my car while running an Alano Club. An Alano Club is a place where they hold Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and other recovery meetings as well. And it was open 12 hours a day. It was a community. And I was part of that community for 14 years. Since I left there in 2007 to find a housing voucher, I really haven't been part of a community. One story comes to mind in particular. There was a fellow who had come. He had at one time been sober at the Alano Club before I was part of it, and he was living on the East Coast, and he had taken a bus because he had wanted to get sober again. And so he took this bus, and he came all the way to the club, and he was very quiet, and he kept to himself except for the few people who he knew, and he stayed out on the balcony. What I didn't know is he was still detoxing from opiates. But as the days wore on, as he sat out on the patio, I learned his name and started to get to know him a little bit. And one night, as the club was closing and we were all getting ready to leave, he was in a bit of a panic because he had lost the screw to his eyeglasses, and he was sleeping outside, and he was disabled, and he really couldn't see without his glasses, and so it was really important. And so several of us who were also homeless, who were staying till the end, till we closed the club, um, he had lost it on the bathroom floor, and the bathroom floor were these crazy colored tiles, and it was very hard to see because part of them were black and brown and yellows. And so all of us got down on the floor. He couldn't get down on the floor because his disability prevented that, and we were touching all of the surface of the bathroom floor. And at one point I looked up and I saw him looking at us, and his eyes were full of tears. He said, "You guys actually care." Um, and we did, and we do. I'm still in contact with him. We write on email several times a day. In the years since I left the club, I have stayed in touch with several of the people and still am. Unfortunately, several of my dear friends have since passed. Health was declining. I was in my car for about 6 years, and there were several people who wrote me letters from the Alano Club trying to get me housing, but it was just not possible. I had to go to another state, and I remember I was calling around local areas, and there was nothing really that I could find in California. I really wasn't proficient on the computer, and still am not that great. Very dyslexic, and so I asked around, and my cousin said she had a friend who had moved to Silver City, New Mexico, and that she had liked it. And so I was calling all these Section 8 offices to see how long their waiting list was, because the waiting lists in California were years long. And so I called, and this very nice woman, who I later got to know, answered the phone. And I asked her, I explained my circumstance, and I asked her how long the waiting list was, and she said, "Oh," she sounded like it was, just the tone of her voice sounded like she was going to tell me it was an incredibly long period of time. And as it turned out, she said, "Oh, 4 months." And I thought to myself, oh, I could do that standing on my head. Well, obviously in my case, not standing on my head, but so I went there. It was only a 13-hour drive, but in my case, it took 5 days. Um, as I began to drive, what would happen each day was I would begin to slumped down like this in my chair. As I got tireder and tireder, and I couldn't see over the steering wheel, and so finally I had this scarf, which I tied around the headrest, and so it kept my head up, so I could continue to drive. Um, so at any rate, I got there. I always had this feeling of being less than. And it was actually during the years in which I lived in my car, in which I just let go of that completely and realized that I was just one small but very important piece, like everyone else, that was part of a tapestry. And so I believe that that tapestry can exist on the internet. It can exist between all of us. Um, and it does exist, but this is a place to connect. When I was young, um, I didn't have many friends. I was a Jewish Italian kid who had moved to South Dakota with my mother and stepfather, and I didn't have many friends for several years. And uh, I remember my friend, uh, when she moved to town, she was Native American, and there weren't very many Native American kids in our school, and they usually had a hard time, um, like I did. And but she was so engaging, my friend Shannon, and so beautiful. She was immediately hanging out with all the popular kids. And I remember she kept trying to be my friend. She really worked at it because I just assumed she wanted to be my friend so she could go back to the popular kids and they could all make fun of me. Um, but she kept it up, and I was really quite lonely. And so I gave in. And she came home with me one night, and she didn't leave. She lived with us for several years, and was dearest friend. I lost her during the pandemic, but I still feel her. And I'll never forget, we were just kids. And after about 6 months of being friends, I said to her, Shannon, why did you persist in trying to be my friend? You know, I didn't really have anything going, and you were friends with all the popular kids. Why did you work at it? She said, because you had F the world on your forehead. And I thought you had found a way to not care what other people thought. But now that I've been your friend and we're best friends, I've discovered that you care just as much as everybody else. It was funny, but now you're my best friend, she said. So, it didn't change anything. You're my best friend. And so I was always sort of an outlier, and unlike Shannon, who could figure out how to fit in, I never quite could. Um, and so uh, what I've realized is just being yourself is no one is less than. Absolutely no one is less than. It doesn't matter what your station in life is. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter what your job is. None of that stuff actually matters. We are all magnificent in our own way. So if you found what I have to say of any value, um, and you've enjoyed it, if you stuck around this long, maybe you did. So please subscribe. It helps the algorithm to find other people like people. And click the like button if you would, because that also helps spread the video around more. And share this with your friends. Um, I know that I'm not too old or too broken to start again, and neither are you. So come along. Um, let's start again. See you soon.